The mercy of Father Solomon. The sun rose over Redemption Creek the way it always did, slow and deliberate, like it was giving folks time to remember who they were before the day demanded they become something else. Father Solomon Webb stood on the church steps, watching that sunrise paint the dusty street in shades of amber and rose. His hands, calloused and scarred in ways that told stories no sermon ever could, rested easy at his sides. One held his worn Bible. The other hung close to where a gun used to sit, back when survival meant something different than it did now. Solomon was 32 years old, though his eyes carried the weight of twice that many years. He was the first Webb born into freedom, delivered into this world 3 months after Lincoln's proclamation reached the plantation where his parents had lived their entire lives in chains. His mother used to say he came out crying with his fists raised, like he was already fighting something. She wasn't wrong. The town of Redemption Creek wasn't like most Western settlements. It had started as a way station for freed slaves heading west, but over the years it had grown into something unusual. A place where black homesteaders, white prospectors, Mexican vaqueros, and Chinese railroad workers all carved out their piece of the frontier together. It wasn't paradise. People brought their hatreds and fears with them like baggage, and those things didn't disappear just because you crossed into new territory. But necessity had a way of making neighbors out of strangers, and Redemption Creek had learned that lesson better than most. Solomon's church was a modest building, rough-hewn timber with a cross made from railroad ties. Inside, the pews were mismatched, some donated, some built by hand, one even salvaged from a burned-out saloon 2 towns over. Every Sunday, those pews filled with faces of every shade, united by need, by hope, by the simple human desire to believe in something bigger than the harshness of daily survival. But Solomon's path to that pulpit had been anything but straight. His father, Josiah Webb, had died when Solomon was 12. The consumption took him slowly, a cruel payment for the years he'd spent in the wet fields of Louisiana, breathing air that wasn't meant for human lungs. Solomon's mother, Sarah, did her best to raise him and his younger sister Ruth alone, taking in washing and mending to keep them fed. But the frontier was unforgiving to a black woman with 2 children and no husband. Solomon learned quickly that the world didn't care about your circumstances. It only cared whether you could stand up after it knocked you down. He fell in with some older boys who taught him how to shoot. It turned out he had a gift for it, an unnaturally steady hand, and an eye that could track a sparrow's flight at 100 yards. By 15, he could outdraw most grown men. By 17, he'd killed 2 men who'd tried to rob his mother. The law called it self-defense. His soul called it something else. His mother saw the darkness gathering in him like storm clouds. One night, after he came home with bloody knuckles from a fight he'd started, she sat him down at their small kitchen table and told him something he never forgot. "You got your daddy's hands," she said, taking his scarred knuckles in her gentle fingers. "Strong hands, fighting hands. But you also got his heart, Solomon. Your daddy never let what was done to him turn him into something cruel. He died a free man because he kept his soul free even when his body wasn't. You understand what I'm telling you?" He understood, but understanding and accepting were 2 different things. The change came slowly. He started attending services at the small church, initially just to make his mother happy. But something in those old hymns, in the words about redemption and grace, began to work on him like water on stone. The preacher, an elderly white man named Reverend Hutchins, took an interest in the angry young man in the back pew. He gave Solomon books to read, engaged him in theological debates that lasted hours, and most importantly, never pretended that faith meant ignoring the ugliness of the world. "Being a man of God doesn't mean being weak," Hutchins told him once. "It means being strong enough to choose mercy when the world tells you to choose vengeance." When Hutchins died, he left Solomon his Bible and a letter recommending him for seminary. Solomon was 22 when he became an ordained minister. His mother wept with joy. His sister Ruth, who'd married a blacksmith named Marcus and started a family, said she'd known all along that the violence in him was just protection for something gentler underneath. He came to Redemption Creek 5 years ago, when the town's previous minister left for California. The congregation had been skeptical at first. A black preacher who wore his collar with the same ease as he wore the gun belt he no longer needed, who could quote scripture and Whitman in the same breath, who had the scars of a fighter and the voice of a poet. But Solomon had a way of seeing people, really seeing them, and speaking to the struggles they kept hidden. Within a year, his church had become the heart of Redemption Creek. Not everyone loved him, of course. There were men in town who couldn't stomach the sight of a black man in a position of respect. Men like Cyrus Tate, who ran the general store and made no secret of his belief that the races shouldn't mix, let alone worship together. Men like the Brennan brothers, who'd lost their father in the war and blamed every black person they saw for it. But even most of them respected Solomon in their way. They'd seen him sit with old Mrs. Chen when she was dying, holding her hand and speaking prayers in broken Cantonese he'd learned just for her. They'd seen him pull Tommy Rodriguez from the frozen creek and breathe life back into the boy's lungs. They'd seen him break up fights with nothing but his presence and his words, though everyone knew he could have done it with his fists if he chose. And they'd seen him with Maria Alvarez. Maria ran the town's small restaurant with her aunt, serving food that made grown men weep with nostalgia for homes they'd never see again. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with vanity. Strong hands, quick smile, eyes that could see through your nonsense in a heartbeat. She and Solomon had been circling each other for 2 years now, their attraction obvious to everyone but apparently themselves. He'd come by the restaurant most mornings for coffee, and they'd talk about everything and nothing while her aunt watched with knowing amusement. "You know, Father," Maria said one morning, "for a man who talks to God, you're awfully afraid of talking to me about anything real." Solomon smiled into his coffee cup. "Maybe I'm just respecting your space. Or maybe you're a coward. Could be both." She laughed, and the sound was like sunlight through stained glass. Life in Redemption Creek had a rhythm to it. The seasons turned. Babies were born. Old folks died. People worked, argued, loved, and struggled in the way people always had. Solomon tended his flock, settled disputes, performed marriages and funerals, and tried his best to remind folks that the kingdom of God looked a lot more like their strange little town than the segregated world most of them had come from. Then the Cortland gang rode in on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. There were 7 of them, led by a man named Jack Cortland who'd made a name for himself robbing banks and stagecoaches across 3 territories. They came into town like they owned it, their horses kicking up dust, their laughter too loud and too mean. They tied up outside the saloon and proceeded to drink, gamble, and make everyone nervous. Solomon was visiting the Johnsons when it started. Mrs. Johnson had just had her 4th baby, and he'd come to offer a blessing and bring some food that Maria had packed. He heard the gunshots and was out the door before the sound faded, running toward the main street. The Cortland gang had shot up the saloon, apparently for fun. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. They could do what they wanted, and nobody was going to stop them. The town's sheriff, a decent man named Porter who was better at paperwork than gunfighting, stood in the street looking pale and uncertain. Solomon walked up beside him. "Sheriff." "Father, I'm handling this." "I can see that." They watched as one of the gang members, a huge man with a red beard, grabbed Maria's arm as she walked past. Solomon was moving before he'd even decided to move, his body responding to a threat the way it had been trained to years ago. "Let her go." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Redbeard laughed. "Or what, preacher? You gonna pray at me?" "I'm gonna ask again, politely. Then I'm gonna make you let her go. Your choice which way this goes." Jack Cortland stepped off the saloon porch, interested now. He was lean and sharp-featured, with eyes like a snake. "Well now, the town's got itself a colored preacher with some spine. That's novel." Solomon kept his eyes on Redbeard. Let her go. Something in his voice, or maybe something in his eyes, made Redbeard release Maria's arm. She stepped back, and Solomon positioned himself between her and the gang. Cortland studied him. You know who I am? I know what you are. The who doesn't much matter to me. That right? Cortland smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. You got sand, preacher. I respect that. Tell you what, we'll drink our drinks, spend our money, and be gone by sundown. No more trouble. How's that sound? Solomon wanted to say no, wanted to tell them to leave right now. But he also knew that 7 armed outlaws against a town of mostly farmers and shopkeepers was a massacre waiting to happen. Sometimes wisdom meant swallowing your pride. Sundown, he said. Then you ride. Cortland tipped his hat, mocking. Sundown it is. They kept their word, more or less. There was more shooting, more intimidation, more cruelty in small doses. But when the sun touched the horizon, they mounted up and rode out, leaving Redemption Creek shaken but intact. They'll be back, Sheriff Porter said quietly, standing beside Solomon as they watched the gang disappear into the dusk. I know. That night, Solomon didn't sleep. He sat in his church, in the dark, wrestling with old ghosts. The man he'd been before the collar, the one who'd known how to solve problems with violence, whispered seductive promises. But the man he'd become, the one who'd chosen a different path, held firm. When Maria found him there at dawn, he was still sitting in the front pew. You're afraid, she said, not a question. Yes. Of them? Of me. She sat beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth. You're not that person anymore, Solomon. Aren't I? You saw how fast I moved yesterday. How easy it would have been to... But you didn't. You chose another way. This time. Every time, she said firmly. Because that's who you are. That's who you chose to be. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw something that made his heart ache. Maria, I know, she said softly. I know. We'll talk about it when this is over. But right now, your town needs you. All of you. The preacher and the man who was before. She was right. She was always right. The Cortland gang came back 3 weeks later, and this time they weren't interested in just passing through. They arrived on a Sunday morning during services. Solomon was mid-sermon when he heard the horses. The congregation fell silent as the church doors burst open and Jack Cortland walked in, his men behind him, all of them armed. Well now, Cortland said, looking around at the mixed congregation with theatrical disdain. Ain't this something? All the colors of the rainbow singing and praying together, like God gives a damn what color you are. Solomon stood in his pulpit, utterly calm. Service isn't over. You're welcome to sit and wait, or you can leave and we'll speak when we're done. Cortland laughed. Oh, I like you, preacher. I really do. But see, we've got business. This town, Redemption Creek, that's a stupid name, first of all. We're renaming it, and we're going to be staying here a while. Collecting taxes, you might say. Starting with whatever's in that collection plate. No, Solomon said simply. The church went deathly quiet. No? Cortland's hand moved to his gun. You sure about that? I'm sure that you're going to walk out of this church right now, get on your horses, and leave this town. And I'm sure that if you don't, you're going to regret it. Redbeard, the big man from before, laughed. You planning to shoot us, preacher? Thought you people didn't believe in violence. We believe in protecting our home, and you're threatening it. What happened next happened fast. One of Cortland's men, jumpy and probably drunk, drew his gun. Solomon moved like water, diving from the pulpit as the shot splintered the wood where he'd been standing. The congregation scattered, diving for cover, and in the chaos the gang ran out. But everyone knew this wasn't over. This was a declaration of war. The town held a meeting that night in the church, because even in crisis, It was where they came together. Everyone talked at once. Suggestions for fleeing, for paying the gang off, for sending to Fort Collins for the army, which was at least a week's ride away. Solomon stood at the front, waiting. Finally, Marcus, his brother-in-law the blacksmith, stood up. Some of you know that Father Webb didn't always wear that collar. Some of you know he grew up hard, and he's got skills that don't usually go with preaching. The room stirred with uncomfortable awareness. We need those skills now, Marcus continued. We need someone who can stand up to Cortland, who can protect us. No. It was Maria who spoke, standing up in the back. We don't need Solomon to become a killer for us. There has to be another way. I'm not going to kill anyone, Solomon said quietly, and the room fell silent. But Marcus is right about one thing. Running won't help. Paying them off won't help. Cortland wants this town, and men like him don't stop until they're stopped. So what do we do? Sheriff Porter asked. Solomon looked around at his congregation, at the people he'd married and buried and counseled and prayed with. We stand together, and we prepare to defend our home. But we do it with rules. No one shoots to kill unless there's absolutely no other choice. We aim to wound, to disable, to stop the threat without becoming murderers ourselves. Can we agree to that? There was murmuring, but eventually heads began to nod. The next week was spent in preparation. The men who could shoot practiced. Those who couldn't learn to load rifles and prepare defensive positions. The women and children were taught safe places to hide if shooting started. Solomon worked with Sheriff Porter to set up a defense plan, drawing on tactical knowledge he wished he didn't have. And he practiced. Every morning before dawn, out past the edge of town, he drew and fired at targets. His hands remembered what his soul had tried to forget. But this time, he practiced differently, aiming for shoulders, for legs, for places that would stop a man without killing him. Maria caught him one morning watching from the tree line. "You're scared this will change you back," she observed. "Wouldn't you be?" She walked over to him, took the gun from his hand, and set it on the fence post. The man you were before had no choice. He was fighting to survive in a world that wanted him dead. This man, the one standing here, is fighting to protect people he loves, with rules that honor life even in the middle of violence. They're not the same. How can you be sure? Because I know you, because God knows you, and because after this is over, you're going to come back to who you are, and we're going to have that conversation we've been avoiding. Despite everything, he smiled. That a promise? That's a promise. The Cortland gang returned on a Thursday afternoon, riding in with all the confidence of men who'd never been seriously challenged. They expected fear. They expected compliance. They found a ghost town. The street was empty, doors and windows shuttered. No sound but the wind and their horses' hooves. "Well, hell," Cortland said, pulling up in the middle of the street. "Looks like they all ran. That's disappointing." "Or it's a trap," said Redbeard. Cortland shrugged. "Either way, we're taking this town. Spread out. Search the buildings." "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Solomon's voice came from the church bell tower, amplified so it echoed off every building. "No." Cortland looked up but couldn't see him through the tower's shadows. "The preacher. Come on down here and let's talk this through like civilized folk." "There's nothing to talk through. You're leaving. Now. Or we make you leave." "We?" Cortland laughed. "How many guns you got up there? 3? 4? We're 7, preacher, and we're not afraid of some farmers with squirrel rifles." "Last chance," Solomon called out. "Ride away. Nobody has to bleed today." For an answer, Cortland drew his gun and fired at the tower. The shot pinged off the bell, sending a long, mournful note across the town. Solomon sighed. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to this. He gave the signal, one sharp whistle. The town exploded with gunfire. From windows, from rooftops, from behind water troughs and building corners, 20 guns opened up. But they weren't shooting to kill. Following Solomon's plan, they were shooting to control, forcing the gang members off their horses, pinning them down, giving them nowhere to go. Solomon came down from the tower, his own gun in hand, walking calm and steady into the chaos. He could see the whole scene with perfect clarity, the way time seemed to slow down when violence erupted. One of Cortland's men was aiming at Mrs. Chen's position. Solomon fired, hitting the man's shoulder. He went down with a scream, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. Redbeard charged at Solomon, apparently deciding to settle things the old-fashioned way. Solomon didn't shoot. He sidestepped, using the big man's momentum against him, and struck him behind the knee with the butt of his gun. Redbeard collapsed like a felled tree. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes. When it was over, all 7 members of the Cortland gang were down, wounded in arms and legs and shoulders, but alive. The townsfolk emerged from cover, guns still trained on the outlaws. Cortland, bleeding from a leg wound, looked up at Solomon with something like respect. "I underestimated you, preacher. You underestimated all of us. We're done being afraid." Dr. Sarah Morrison, the town's physician, a sharp-eyed woman who'd come west to escape an unhappy marriage, was already moving among the wounded, but she stopped when she reached Cortland. "These men deserve what they get," she said, looking at Solomon. "We should let them bleed." Several voices agreed. The anger, the fear, all of it was bubbling up now that the danger had passed. Solomon stepped forward. "No." "Father," Dr. Morrison started. "No," he repeated, louder. He looked around at his neighbors, his congregation. "I know what you're feeling. God knows I feel it too. These men came here to hurt us, to take what wasn't theirs. They don't deserve mercy." He paused, letting that sit. But that's exactly why we have to give it. Because mercy isn't for the deserving. If it was, none of us would ever receive it. Mercy is for the broken, the lost, the ones who've forgotten they're human. And if we become the kind of people who can watch men bleed out because they don't deserve saving, then we've lost something more important than this town. We've lost ourselves. The silence that followed was heavy. Dr. Morrison looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Damn you and your sermons, Solomon." But she knelt beside Cortland and began examining his wound. "Maria," Solomon called out, "can you help the doctor? And Marcus, I need you and some others to ride to Fort Collins. These men need to face justice, proper justice." As people moved to follow his instructions, Solomon felt the adrenaline finally drain from his body. His hands were shaking. He sat down hard on the steps of his church, suddenly exhausted. Maria found him there after Dr. Morrison had patched up the last of the outlaws and they'd been secured in Sheriff Porter's small jail. She sat beside him, took his shaking hands in hers. "You did it," she said. "You protected us without losing yourself." "I came close," he admitted. "When I saw Cortland aim toward your restaurant, when I thought you might be in there, Maria, for a second, I wanted to kill him. Would have been easy. Would have felt righteous. But you didn't. No. I remembered what my mother told me about keeping your soul free. And I remembered what Reverend Hutchins said about being strong enough to choose mercy." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over Redemption Creek. Still standing, still whole, still itself. "You promised we'd talk," Solomon said finally. "After this was over." Maria smiled. "So I did." "Maria Alvarez, I have been half in love with you since the day you told me my theology was sound, but my Spanish was terrible. And I've been fully in love with you since the morning you brought soup to Mrs. Chen and sat with her for 3 hours, just so she wouldn't die alone. That was 2 years ago. I know. I'm a slow learner. She laughed, and it was the best sound he'd ever heard. Solomon Webb, I've loved you since the first time I saw you with the Rodriguez children, teaching them their letters in the church basement. You were so patient, so kind, and when little Anna couldn't get the alphabet right, you sang it to her until she did. So what do we do about it? Well, she said, I suppose you could ask me to marry you. Maria Alvarez, will you marry me? Yes, obviously. Did you think I was going to say no? They were still laughing when the rest of the town found them, and someone started playing a fiddle, and before Solomon quite knew what was happening, there was dancing in the street. Life in Redemption Creek went on. The Cortland gang was tried and imprisoned. Word got around that the little integrated town in the middle of nowhere was not to be trifled with. People still struggled. There were still disputes and prejudices, and all the small failures that make up human existence. But there was also hope. There was also mercy. And every Sunday, people gathered in that rough timber church to sing and pray together, led by a black preacher who wore his collar like armor and his past like a lesson learned. Solomon and Maria were married that winter in a ceremony that brought tears to eyes that had seen too much hardness. They built a small house next to the church, and Maria kept running the restaurant while Solomon tended his flock. On quiet mornings, he'd sit on his porch and watch the sun rise over Redemption Creek, this strange little town that had become home. His gun hung on the wall inside, cleaned and oiled but unused. Sometimes he'd look at it and remember the man he'd been, the violence he'd known, the darkness he'd carried. But mostly he looked at Maria, at the town he loved, at the life he'd chosen, and felt grateful. Grateful for the hard mercy of a mother who'd refused to let her son become cruel. Grateful for the patient wisdom of a preacher who'd taught him that strength could be gentle. Grateful for a town that had let him be both things, the fighter and the priest, and accepted him as whole. The frontier was still hard. Life was still a struggle. But here, in this place called Redemption Creek, people had learned that they were stronger together than apart, that mercy was not weakness, and that sometimes the bravest thing a man could do was choose peace when violence would be easier. Solomon Webb had been born into freedom, but he'd had to fight for it anyway. Fight against the world's cruelty, against his own darkness, against the easy answers that violence always promised. And in the end, he'd won not by being harder than the hard men, but by being something they could never be. He'd won by staying human,